When German women prisoners of war first entered American custody near the end of World War II, many of them carried not only physical exhaustion and hunger, but a deep, almost paralyzing fear shaped by years of relentless propaganda. And among the questions whispered quietly between bunk beds and behind guarded glances, one stood out as both heartbreaking and revealing. Do Americans really beat prisoners for fun? A belief so ingrained that some women brace themselves daily for random violence, humiliation, or punishment, because Nazi authorities had repeatedly warned them that surrender to the Americans meant cruelty without limits. These women, many drawn from auxiliary units, labor details, or evacuated support roles, had lived under a system where discipline was enforced through fear, shouting, and physical punishment, and where power was demonstrated through domination rather than restraint. So it felt natural to assume that the enemy would be even worse. Yet the moment they gathered the courage to ask an American guard this question, often through interpreters, sometimes haltingly in broken English, the response they received was calm, almost puzzled, and utterly disarming, because the soldiers did not laugh, threaten, or mock them, but instead answered plainly that beating prisoners was forbidden, unnecessary, and wrong, and that no one in the camp was allowed to harm them simply for amusement or control. According to later testimonies, some soldiers even looked genuinely confused by the question, explaining that discipline existed, rules existed, but violence for its own sake was not part of how they operated, a response that stunned the women far more than any act of cruelty ever could, because it directly contradicted the worldview they had been taught since childhood. In the days that followed, the absence of fear became increasingly noticeable, as roll calls passed without shouting. Infractions were addressed verbally, medical care was given without punishment, and guards intervened to stop harassment rather than encourage it, slowly proving that the answer they had received was not a lie or a temporary performance, but policy backed by principle. Historians note that American POW camps were bound by the Geneva Convention and reinforced by strict military discipline, meaning that guards who abused prisoners could themselves face serious punishment. But for the women experiencing this reality firsthand, it felt revolutionary because power was being exercised through control and responsibility rather than terror. Over time, the women began to test the truth of what they had been told, not through rebellion, but through small acts of vulnerability, such as asking for medical help, requesting clarification of rules, or admitting fear. And each time, the response reinforced the same pattern: firmness without cruelty, authority without humiliation, strength without sadism. One former POW later recalled that the moment she truly believed the war was over for her was not when she was captured, but when she realized days had passed without anyone raising a hand or voice at her, an experience so foreign that it felt almost unreal. Conversations among the women slowly changed tone, shifting from whispered dread to cautious disbelief, and eventually to reflection, as they began to understand that the image of Americans as violent brutes had been carefully constructed to keep them obedient and afraid, and that its collapse left them confronting a painful truth about how thoroughly they had been lied to. Some women admitted feeling anger not toward their captors, but toward the system that had filled their minds with terror, because the contrast between expectation and reality was impossible to ignore, especially as American soldiers consistently demonstrated self-control even in moments of stress, fatigue, or provocation. In later interviews, several women remembered the exact phrasing of the reply they received to that fearful question, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple and sincere. And in that simplicity, it carried enormous power, dismantling years of indoctrination in a single conversation. In the broader history of the war, this moment stands as a reminder that how power is exercised matters just as much as who holds it, and that restraint, professionalism, and respect can leave a deeper impression than violence ever could. Because for German women POWs who arrived expecting abuse for sport, The shock was not kindness alone, but the realization that true authority does not need cruelty to sustain itself, and that sometimes the most devastating blow to propaganda is not argument or force, but calm truth, spoken without anger, delivered by people who choose dignity even in the aftermath of war.